I'm Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner, but I live in Colorado. I'm a historian, I'm an outdoorsman, and I'm a movie buff. I hunt and I fish, I kayak and I climb mountains. I like to explore old places and ask new questions. I'm curious about the world. And this is a reckoning. It's always the countdown that makes me feel like official on this thing. So it's what, 6 a.m. over on your time right now?
6 a.m. Yeah.
Dude, the commitment we are both showing to this podcast this morning. Like, if you're listening in, we're doing it. What are you drinking? Is that coffee? What do you got?
I do have a strong. This is probably like a triple shot of espresso with a bit of oat milk in here. So
I will see that, sir, and match you my Cuban coffee
nice.
This morning.
You've got a cuter cup though, for sure.
Yeah. So for people listening in, this cup has a kitten with some butterflies on it. This was sent to me by my son, and it says, "Pretty sure no one asked you" on the bottom, which is kind of what we do over here. So it's how I get up and roll, dude. I'm so excited to talk to you about this book and also your work. I kept reading this thing. It's like, first of all, I have no idea how you pulled this shit off. So bravo. I'm sure you hear that all the time. Oh, we're going to. Like, I'm in on this. All right, before we do that, let's introduce you. Kieran, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us what you're doing here?
Sure. My name is Kieran Fox. I'm a neuroscientist by training. I did a PhD in neuroscience back in Canada, where I'm from, in Vancouver. Studied the neuroscience of meditation. Then I went to medical school. I'm now a fairly new doctor. I've been doing psychiatry for a couple of years now at University of California, San Francisco. And I'm on a research path with that to do research with psychedelic drugs and, in the world of psychiatry, and try to help people with, depression, PTSD. That's kind of the goal right now. But before all that, before I spent, my entire adult life in grad school, I was actually really into Buddhism, really into spirituality. I went and lived as a Buddhist monk in Nepal and India, and I was doing that in Canada as well, actually, when I was in college. So I kind of had this dual life in a lot of ways, where spirituality was a huge part of it early on, and then, academia, pretty hard science, medicine has been my life for the last almost 15 years now. But underneath it all, there's been this spiritual stuff and this ongoing meditation and interest in all these things. And all that kind of culminated in this book, which we're going to get into for sure. But it kind of just came together one day, and couldn't really say no, and just kind of had to write this thing. And it's finally out there now. So
now, brother, when I was listening, when I was reading the book and kind of reading about your own spiritual journey, it's like the pieces were kind of coming together a bit as I was reading this, and it's so freaking cool. The stuff that you've done, really kind of coming from Canada. I guess maybe the first question I have for you is, what is it like to have a fully functioning healthcare system for our American audience? How does that look?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, because I never really used it much when I was younger. It hasn't really been an issue, but I have had to use it a couple times here, and it's been difficult for sure. I mean, it's there is a healthcare system kind of for people who don't have insurance here. It's the county hospitals. And so as long as you go in through an emergency room, you get healthcare. But it's just not quite the same thing. And I'm now working in a private hospital, and it's very, very different. Everyone has their family involved, and everyone's got some kind of insurance or another. So very different. But I have had personal experience battling with insurance companies for obvious stuff that they should cover, even though I had insurance. And that was pretty jarring to realize what most people probably go through, just them trying to decline everything just by default. So
I have to tell you, one of my best friends is he's an attorney for an insurance company. And so, I'm on the text thread, right? And he'll tell me, I'm going in for a trial. And of course, I have to tell him good luck, but I feel like I'm rooting for the umpire. Every time I was like, all right, Mike, I hope, wear your nice watch. I hope it goes well. No, I don't. I want you to lose, buddy. I love you, buddy, but I just want you to lose so bad. I want for your children to be destitute. He's listening in right now. So, it's why, Kieran? Why Einstein of all the people? What attracted you to write this book, which I actually have dude, this is a gorgeous freaking book. This is so
Awesome.
cool.
Yeah.
I love people are going to come to my house and think I'm smart after seeing your book
Yeah.
on the shelf. So,
I feel the same way after writing it. I've got a whole
why,
shelf of Einstein books when I walk into my apartments.
you know, I'm in the middle of writing my first book, but it's about cattle in Florida, and no one's gonna be like, oh, it's like, I guess, yeah, indeed, I suppose. Why Einstein? Like, what attracted you to this man?
Yeah, it was quotations from Einstein that did it. I was actually working on a different book, which will end up being my second book, on more in my wheelhouse of spirituality and neuroscience, and kind of how the brain evolved to allow for ecstatic spiritual experience and sort of transcendental feelings. And I was kind of looking for other people similar to me, who had a scientific background, but also these spiritual interests. And these quotes from Einstein kept coming up of kind of, scientists with this sort of reverence for the cosmos, or this sense of unity, even in these scientific figures. And the quotes were just so good. And you saw many of them in the book. And I was like, I'm going to look a little deeper into this. And then I realized there's a real story here, and that he had, real spiritual background and interests, and he knew about Eastern religion, and he traveled to Japan, all these things I didn't know. And, I'll be honest, I thought, well, this will be way shorter and easier to write. So I'll bang this out in, 6 months or a year. I'll just make a really short book, and that'll be a good preparation for writing my first real book.
For your real book.
And it ended up taking 3.5 years because I was in medical school, of course. So I didn't have a lot of time to work on it. But
yeah, I was reading this, and you're like, oh, I wrote this during medical school. I'm like, does Kieran sleep? It was the first, like, how did you write this during med school? I have not been to med school. I've watched a bunch of medical school dramas. How did you make the time to, like, I'm not even interested, Kieran, in like, as much in the actual time part, but intellectually creating the space, because you're spending all this time thinking about the body and healing and things like that. And then trying to, like, I guess maybe flip a switch and think about this book. How did you do that, dude?
Yeah, I'm still not really sure, but I wrote about it. I don't know if you got to the very end. I wrote in the acknowledgments a little bit about how that happened. And I think in some sense I was kind of losing my mind in med school. And in some sense, this made it worse. And in another sense, it made it better. And it kind of gave a unifying goal, and it reminded me of all the reasons I was there. Beyond that, I don't really know. It was absolutely like an obsession, honestly. I mean, I would get up early and work on it. I would work on it in the evenings. I'd work on it on weekends, anytime I had time. And the one good thing with med school is the day-to-day schedule is awful, but you do get these chunks of time off when you're supposed to be studying for your license exams, for example, which I wouldn't do. I'd be writing instead, and then I would cram in studying for the license exam at the last second, or time to do interviews for residency programs. So kind of anytime I had a chance, what people would usually do in vacation, I was basically writing and working on the book. So, and then I finished it in my intern year here, which was also a really crazy time. But
yeah, you got this thing done. It's quite literally sitting on my desk as I'm looking at it. It's actually holding my phone right now. Let's talk about Einstein himself, if we can. Your book starts in you kill Einstein at the very beginning of your book. Congratulations for that. And you're starting really kind of with his death and kind of working your way, start at the end and kind of work your way back towards it. The man dies in 55, and I don't know Einstein well. In fact, I would say, Kieran, like, the most that I really know of Einstein is maybe an idea of Albert Einstein versus, like, himself. I almost kind of see him as, like, this whimsical kind of guy that pop culture has kind of given me this impression of, versus this real dude, which is the thing that I found so good about your book. I got to, like, get to know the man himself versus, like, depictions of the man. He dies in 55. You write, like, the day before he dies, he's like, I'm okay. I've done my work. I'm good to go.
Yeah.
How is he looking at the world at the end of his days?
Yeah, I think there was a mix of a lot of hopefulness, and he was still campaigning for essentially world government and nuclear disarmament and world peace. And that's why I opened it that way. And I said the last thing he worked on was actually a speech. I believe it was supposed to be given in Israel. And I believe it was the 7th or 8th anniversary of Israeli independence. And he was supposed to be writing a speech calling for peace and, peace in the Middle East and et cetera. And he also, one of the last things he did was sign this this call for nuclear disarmament that Bertrand Russell had been circulating around to some famous intellectuals to try to sort of turn the tide on that. But the other last thing he worked on his deathbed, he also had some handwritten notes for his unified field theory, which, his probably 30th or 40th incarnation of that theory, which never panned out. And he, scribbled a few equations, and he's like, "Oh, I'll work on my theory a little bit. You never know." So I think to the very end, I think that's the theme of the whole book, is this unity that, every little piece, every person, every country, every physical phenomenon, all of it is part of this unified underlying thing. And that dominated his life, both, spiritually or ethically, if you want to call it that, from the point of view of how he saw human society and how humans should interact, and also in terms of physics and his scientific worldview. So it just seemed like the perfect moment. I'm like, that sort of shows you, right? And what I wanted to do is end it with his last words. But there's a famous story actually that he mumbled his last few words in German when he was really out of it. And the nurse was American and didn't speak German. This is, right after World War II. No one was sort of learning German back then. And so his last words and she didn't even remember what they were in German. She didn't know enough to sort of tell everybody afterwards so they could be translated. So his last words are lost. And I was like, damn it, because that's kind of the perfect epitaph. What was the last thing he said? But the next best thing is, what was he working on, because he was always working pretty much. So that's why I opened it that way, because I think it is emblematic. It's kind of his last words. In place of that, we have his last things he wrote. So
I don't know how you don't find some nurse who speaks German.
Yeah, for
get to this German of all people. Like, you think this is the guy whose words we might. he's like, I figured it out. You guys wait, and then he gives it to us. It's like, I figured out time travel. You talk though about the name of the book is "I Am a Part of Infinity." You want to talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'll tell you what I've told other people. I love the quote. As soon as I saw it, it's a quote from Einstein, of course. Right. And the second I saw it, I knew this was the title of the book. It just rang kind of perfect for me. And I love it because it has this sort of mathematical vibe to it, like infinity or totally infinite, but it also has this spiritual side. So it just seemed like the perfect phrase. And he used it in a conversation with this poet, William Hermans, who had 4 conversations with him over the years. He'd come to Princeton or to Berlin when Einstein was still there, and talked to him about philosophy and spirituality, which is all that Hermans was really interested in. And it's basically a paraphrase of something Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher, said, which is that I'm a part of the eternal. I see everything under the aspect of eternity, and that's it's a similar idea to what we were just talking about. Whereas if you can kind of see things in a unified perspective, they kind of become that. It's almost like if you can alter your perception, then your ontology almost changes to go with it. It's like you can't literally force everything to be one thing, but if you see it the right way, or if you feel it that way, then you kind of have achieved that unity. So it's paraphrase of Spinoza, who was also a monist, who also believed in this sort of divine substance underlying everything that gave birth to everything around us and all multiplicity. And what I really love about it actually is it's in the first person. So I thought a lot about the title, obviously, and many people told me I should just shorten it to Part of Infinity. And I was like, oh, that's actually, it's snappier, but I was like, it's missing the key thing, because you have to say the message of the book if you read the title. Basically, just reading it alone, you kind of consciously or unconsciously you're absorbing the key message. So
did Basic fight you on the title of the book?
No, they love the title, actually. Yeah, I think my agent, my editor, everyone loved the title. The subtitle, there was a bit more back and forth because we weren't sure what to do with that.
Subtitles are always like that. I'm gearing up for my own book and figure out what the heck. I cannot figure out what the title of this thing. The dissertation title is easy, right? Because you just come up with something, you put a colon behind it, and then you go defend the thing. You're absolutely right. Like, the idea is it situates Einstein in his own story, right? And I think that's really the key aspect here. I want to ask you, does Einstein believe there's a new pope in the world, and religion is everywhere? And I am devoutly non-religious, Kieran. I grew up Southern Baptist. I don't have a religion at all. I kind of walked away from any kind of definitive religion growing up. But I'm always curious about other people's view on the world, on the cosmos, supernatural, stuff like that. So does Einstein believe in a God? Does he believe in an all powerful being? Like what's his thoughts on this?
Yeah, he definitely not in the ordinary sense that almost anybody would understand or sort of adhere to today. He very famously said, I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in, I'm paraphrasing, but who reveals himself in sort of the natural order or the harmony of natural law, who reveals himself in the physical world. So the word he used as sort of the best approximation, although he never actually signed on to this, was pantheist. And that's, again, how Spinoza is described, even though Spinoza didn't use that word either. That word was made up, I think, a couple hundred years later by another scholar. But the basic idea is that you do have kind of a reverence for some divine power, but it's not something separate from the world. So it's a very unusual idea to people today because no one's really a pantheist. And I said this before too, into another podcast. I said, I don't know any pantheists, so it's hard to explain. And I think I might kind of be one, but I'm the closest thing. But it's something that no one really believes or follows today. But it's sort of the idea that everything is divine or everything's a manifestation of the divine. And again, Spinoza would call it, he used the word substance as the kind of underlying thing. And the idea is that it's not just the world, though, in the physical sense that, all the atoms and all the energy is part of some divine being following laws, but so are we, right? And so are our minds, all our emotions. All of this is another, higher manifestation in some sense of the same underlying substance. And I think that's the closest thing to describe what Einstein saw as God, or his view of kind of the holiness of the universe or of reality.
I have to tell you, I kind of like that, right?
Yeah.
There's a sense of like, why do we do what we do? And so, someone had asked me about this recently, like what, like with all of the negativity in the world, like why do we struggle? Like, why do we carry on?
Yeah.
I like the idea, Kieran, of there's some sense of higher power, purpose of connect. And I guess maybe that's what keeps coming back to me as I read your book, is this interconnectivity of everything. I wonder, does this go back to the idea of like a Big Bang kind of thing where we're all this one thing that kind of spreads out later on? Like, do you get the sense that like his view of the supernatural is affected by his mathematical reasons or his ways, scientific reasoning of the cosmos? Like, how does he arrive? Certainly he's looking and reading these other dudes, but does science affect his spirituality?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question. Let's start with the Big Bang because you probably remember I opened the book that way. And I do think, and I was actually very wary of opening with that parallel because I didn't want it to seem too cheesy or too kind of Deepak Chopra and just be like, oh, we're all one. But I'm like, but it's kind of true. And I mean, this is what science actually tells us, is that what Einstein was trying to achieve in his unified field theory is to show that, the present moment, the entire universe, everything is one thing. That's what the unified field theory was sort of aiming to achieve, is that a single equation, a single way to describe everything is part of one substrate, essentially. But what cosmology has done is push that back in time, essentially. And that's like our current cosmological model is that if you rewind the tape, everything comes back to one single point. And that's the primordial singularity or the initial singularity. And I don't think, again, people think about that too much, but just how mind-blowing that is that, again, these are speculative models, obviously, right? And we can't know 100%. We don't really understand what that singularity was. But everything we do understand currently suggests that there was a single origin for everything. It was like unified. It was one thing, and it exploded out into everything else, created space and time, and all the other beings and atoms and energy all came from this single original source, which is very, very similar to a lot of religious ideas and a lot of mystical religious ideas in particular. So I thought that was a really interesting parallel. And where did this come from? I think that's kind of a chicken and egg kind of feedback loop thing where there's this yearning for unity. And then scientists find some of it. And that's what I tried to describe also in the intro to the book, is that, Newton, Kepler, Galileo, the scientific revolution, they're kind of uniting heaven and earth, because before that you have this idea that the heavens are something different and, there's angels up there, or there's like, in Aristotle, there's some immutable perfect substance up there, like the crystalline sphere of the stars, and it doesn't really change. It's permanent and eternal and it's perfect. And then we have this earthly world full of, death and disease and things that change and nothing lasts forever down here. And what they showed is, again, it's unity in a sense that we take totally for granted today, that no, actually it's the same atoms up there in the moon and the sun. It's the same kind of energy, same kind of light, all those little points of light out there. Those are other stars. There's probably other planets just like ours out there. So you get this different idea of unity from science from the very beginning, in the scientific revolution. And I'll add one more thing, which is that what Einstein was coming at it from this perspective of the Pythagoreans. And this is something I spent a lot of time in the book trying to trace, because the traces are pretty faint, and it's kind of hard to show that from very ancient times, about 500 BC in Greece, if not earlier, but already by then there was this idea that there's this underlying unity. There's a kind of pantheistic flavor to it, that this unity is divine or is kind of the divine source, and that the way to understand it is with mathematics and geometry. And that sort of becomes the Pythagorean school, and that seeps into Plato, and it seeps into all of Western philosophy through the centuries, and then into modern science and physics. And what I show in the book, which I thought was so cool, is that this isn't an accidental. This isn't just part of the cultural osmosis that they happen to know, oh, math is useful and we're all into math. It's that everyone was very well aware of this. They'd all heard of Pythagoras. They all knew that Pythagoreanism was sort of this attempt to blend reason and religion, or kind of the rational and revelation, into a single worldview. And they were all very much on board with that. And they all sort of saw physics in the same way. I mean, I'm speaking about the quantum physicists and Einstein's kind of colleagues at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, there's this idea as I read through your book, and maybe the first person to put this in my head was actually Kelsey Johnson. She's an astrophysicist out at Virginia. She was on the pod several months ago, and as I read your book, I kept thinking about how well it was in conversation with her stuff, which is how all of these scientists are really trying to probe this idea of the cosmos, and then coming back to this idea of this very spiritual understanding of what it is we're doing here. And I'm kind of wondering, Einstein talks about this idea of a cosmic religion. What is that, Kieran?
Yeah, I think we've kind of been describing it, so it's hard to put your finger on, because it's not something where there's some holy book and you just sort of say oh, here are the rules,
right?
And the origin story. But there's kind of these traces all over the place, and I think it's a little bit unfortunate almost that none of them ever sort of put it all down on paper. But at the same time, it's such a subtle thing that I'm not sure you could, because in some sense, it's all of science is part of it, right? Any attempt to understand the universe is kind of a holy quest, or kind of a sacred journey, or a sacred kind of knowledge of some kind, because there's the heart of it is this reverence for the reality we're actually in, and this kind of awe for how complex and beautiful the world is based on these seemingly very simple laws. And I would say the kind of the fundamental faith of it, that's kind of, actually, the whole book is basically, this is a secret, but I'll tell you, the whole book is based on the branches of philosophy. There's aesthetics and ontology and metaphysics, epistemology. Each chapter of the core chapters is one aspect of kind of a typical view of philosophy, but in terms of the cosmic religion. So the chapter on wonder and awe is kind of the aesthetics of, what's beautiful about our world. And the Pythagorean chapter is kind of the epistemology. How do you know reality? And it's through mathematics, essentially, from Einstein's point of view, or from the point of view of the cosmic religion. So each chapter of the book is kind of exploring an aspect of it. And that's sort of how long it took to explain the cosmic religion. But I think, the aesthetic side of it, and then the epistemological side of it, is kind of knowing it with mathematics. And then there's the side we haven't talked about too much, which is kind of the ethical implications of it, which is also a huge part of most religions, right? What are the rules, or how are you supposed to behave, or how do you go to heaven? And from this worldview, it's very much based on this idea of unity, and kind of taking not the only implication from that, but I think one of the most obvious ones, which is compassion, kindness to others, pacifism, essentially. And so that's kind of what spins out of it ethically. But
I'm thinking now that the rule book was actually given in German on his deathbed to a nurse. At the very end of his life. I want to ask you, when I came to read your book, what I understood about Einstein and faith and religion and philosophy was Judaism. At least that's what I thought I understood. And I turned out that that's actually not the case at all. In fact, it was a really complicated, weird, kind of relationship. Can you talk a little bit about Albert Einstein's relationship to Judaism and how that kind of affected his thought process?
Yeah, I'd say the religious connection is essentially zero. I don't think he had much interest in it. He did read the Bible. I saw in his archives in
Mm-hmm.
handwritten notes in the Bible, so he definitely knew the Bible. Um, but I don't think he had almost any affinity for the sort of creationist worldview, which is so central to Judaism and Christianity, or the sort of teleological or sort of eschatological um, view of kind of rewards to go to heaven or punishments and you go to hell. I think he had a lot of contempt for that worldview, where we should be good to get a reward, or to avoid being punished by some kind of babysitter or some father figure god. His view of ethics was very much, this is the right thing to do on principle, and that's why you do it. It's what's good for humanity. It's what's good for our own soul. So you kind of do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Um, and but then there's this very complicated relationship, because of course he's Jewish and he's a German Jew, growing up in the 20s and 30s, and so I think that's something that's also very interesting about his life, is it just overlaps with all these key moments of the 20th century. Just not by coincidence, but just because of who he is and where he lived. And so with the rise of Nazism, the Holocaust, the development of nuclear weapons, all these things kind of happening in kind of the prime of his life, actually. So I think he developed a much a deep kind of cultural or ethnic connection to Judaism later in life because of that, because of all the persecution. I point out in the book, some of his family members died, which I didn't know, actually. It's not very well known that two of his cousins, I think, died in concentration camps. And Einstein was actually, I also didn't know this before working on the book, that he was not just hated because he was a Jew, but he was actually on the most wanted list of the Nazis. They had posters of him, wanted dead or alive, with like a bounty on his head, after he left Germany and sort of condemned them publicly on the radio. They raided his house and they, confiscated his things and his finances and so on. So he was specifically targeted by them, actually. So,
Pardon me. I was shocked when I read through your book how well read Einstein was. I'm thinking as to come to this guy, like, okay, he's a scientist. He's obviously deeply trained in mathematics and physics and things like that. And then, as you really illustrate, he is incredibly curious about the world around him. Can you talk a little bit like about the process you had when you started in on this project? Figure, wait a second, this guy's reading everybody. Like, what was I guess, Kieran, I'd like to hear about your process of discovery as alongside of Einstein's process of discovery. Like, how did you see like who he's reading and how that inflects his thoughts in the world?
yeah, I'd literally, it had only been a few days since I decided to start working on this book. I think like maybe 10 or 15 days.
Mm-hmm.
I was like just pulling some quotes together. And then I discovered the archives and I was like, And I emailed them and I said, I saw this little article about someone who used to work at the archives when they were at Princeton, about how many books there were. And I'm like, do you guys still have these books? You're in Jerusalem now, but do you have these books? And they're like, yeah, we have all the books, we have everything. And I was like, is there a list? And they're like, yeah, here's the spreadsheet. So they sent me the Excel spreadsheet, and there's I think about 2,400 books that were left at the end of his life that hadn't been, given away or lost or whatever, in his personal library. And that just kind of blew my mind, that's, as someone who collects and reads a lot of books, and I mean, you don't necessarily read them all, but it's really interesting to me to hear that he was sort of surrounded by them. And then there's little anecdotes I put in the book of, his personal secretary, Helen Dukas, just saying, I wish Gutenberg had never lived. There's too many damn books in the house and it's overflowing and I just can't get around in here. So that was kind of the first tip off that there was a huge amount here, that it wasn't just, he heard about Buddhism once and kind of used a quote or thought it was cool. That there's this deep kind of passion and curiosity outside of his own field that he somehow made time for on top of all the physics he was doing. So that's how I found it. And then it was researching it because of that list. I was able to, read a lot of what he read, actually. And that was pretty key to many parts of the book, especially the older stuff. So I ended up buying some very expensive old books off the internet.
Good for you, dude.
Yeah, like
Good for you.
his friend Maurice Sullivan translated Democritus, the ancient Greek atomist philosopher, into French, which I luckily read because I grew up in Canada and we grew up learning French. So I was able to read that and, find direct evidence of the Pythagorean influence that Einstein knew about the Pythagoreans, and try to understand why he loved Democritus so much and spoke of him almost as kind of like a religious teacher, which he kind of was. And then, reading a lot of the books Einstein read to sort of see if there's evidence for these key ideas that it seems like he believed in. And then I ended up going to the archives, of course, and looking through the books. I think that was one of the most revealing things was I'd read a lot of them already, but then arriving there and looking for handwritten markings because I wanted to know what's the most important thing to him. And I include, I think, 2 or 3 in the book, photos that they let me take and reproduce from the archives of his little diagonal pencil stroke to mark passages he liked. And there's really, really interesting things there, such as that he marked the Tao Te Ching. He had 5 copies of the Tao Te Ching in different translations in English and German. And he marked one German edition he studied is marked more than any other book in his personal library. There's a quarter of the passages in the Tao Te Ching have highlights. And he didn't do that very often. There's probably only 30 or 40 books out of the 2,000 or so that actually have markings in them, any kind of notes or underlining at all. So these very significant things that, it's very hard to see. And you can sort of feel it in his writings and his quotes, like, oh, this feels a lot like Taoism. This kind of is this unifying divine force, but it's not like a God. It's not personal at all. It encompasses death and life. It's not like a good force. It's a creative, sustaining force, but it's not like a good God or a judgmental force. And I years ago, even I could see that was very similar to what I understood from Taoism. But then to go there and see that Einstein's copy is marked up and there's all these passages, the passage I put in the book is actually that, you can encounter the Tao anywhere. You don't have to even leave your house. You look out the window and that's the Tao. You're sitting in your house and that's the Tao. It's absolutely everything, and it permeates everything around you. So that's, I think, from that spreadsheet was really the origin of the book in a lot of ways, just realizing there's a story. And then it kind of culminated with, when I was almost done writing it, ending up at the archives and just sort of living there for about a week.
Can I tell you, as a historian, when I got to those images of the archives, I was all in at that point in time. I was like, yeah, absolutely. Give to me this. And as a man who has plenty of books on my shelves that I have not read, I'm definitely sympathetic to it, to his housekeeper and his secretary, excuse me. Do you also mark up your books when you're reading, or no? Or do you keep them?
Yeah, big time. Yeah. That's that's just something I felt like a lot of like kinship or just kind of like just familiarity from that, because I actually mark things very, very heavily. And this is actually, I meant to say this earlier, asking how did I write this in med school? And my dad actually was one of the first people to read the book when I finished it.
That's cool.
He said, he's like, it took you 4 years, but actually, like, I know you, and we read a lot of the same books, and he shared a lot of books with me. He's like, this is really everything you've read for 20 years is kind of coming in here, and you're pulling in quotes and, stuff you happen to have read back in college. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually totally true. And I actually did an immense amount of going back to stuff I'd read, like Schopenhauer. Actually, that was another key that I love Schopenhauer. I've read him very closely. And once I realized that Einstein also loved Schopenhauer, there's these accounts of him reading Schopenhauer repeatedly and just loving it. And he had the collected works, which I also saw at the archives. Then I knew, if you've read this 3 times, then I know what you've read, and I know the stuff you've been exposed to because it's so obvious to me from reading it. So there was a lot of that sort of just pulling in stuff from my own life, my own reading, and pulling out quotes. I'm like, I know there's a quote in here. I read this 15 years ago, but I can, flip through it and find it. So
I have the hardest time, Kieran, of marking up a book. Especially when I get something brand. Well, initially, right? When it's beautiful and it's like it's got the thing and so forth, and it's like once I mark it, once I take that highlighter, then it's game on. Then it's just all the way through.
Yeah.
But I have to constantly remind myself that I have this fantasy where I'm creating my own archive where someone else is going to come by and read the Jason Herbert collection at some point in time, right? And like, oh, Herbert, this brilliant guy who had a podcast, clearly liked, any number of books or marked these things up. But it is a thing that I continue to wrestle with. But then I find stuff like, like you're talking about, like Einstein's markings. And I'm like, the marginalia tells you so much about what they're thinking, what moved them, to go back and like reread the things and say, oh, okay, this is quite literally where he says, this is important to me. I
Yeah.
think,
I think
it's good.
you should just go for it. It's so important for you too. And I think that's what it really is. It's like you're going back and your past self is telling you, doing some of the work for you and highlighting the important stuff. And I just feel like it makes them my own. I mean, my dad
Thank
actually
you.
gives me shit about that too. Cause he's, like I read in the bath a lot too. Cause that's sort of a peaceful space to just not do anything else and not look at my phone or anything. And he's like, you destroy all your books. You love books so much. You like taking markers and highlighters and you're like destroying them in the bathtub. And I was like, yeah, but a book's kind of like a car, right? Like as soon as you take it off the shelf and buy it, it's not worth anything to anybody else. No one wants a used book really. Right. So, but it's
It's a
worth so much
tool.
to you, right? So yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's at the end of the day, it's a tool, right? And then and a friend of mine who's like, when he gets his books, first thing he does is just marks the crap out of them. It's like,
Yeah.
I own this now. This
Yeah.
this belongs to me, And then I get some used copy that doesn't have anything in it. I don't want to touch it, So
Yeah.
I'm all over the place. You mentioned a couple other guys. You mentioned Pythagoras. You mentioned Spinoza. Gandhi is in this book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about Einstein's relationship to Gandhi and how that affected his worldview?
Yeah. I think, so unfortunately they never got to meet because that would have been an awesome hangout, I
Right.
think, if Gandhi and Einstein got to meet, but they exchanged a few letters. And there was obviously, a lot of mutual kind of respect there. But yeah, I think what Einstein loved about Gandhi so much is that he was this living exemplar, because a lot of the people he held up as kind of these saints almost, or kind of the, exemplars of the cosmic religion. Spinoza, he called kind of the perfect example of his cosmic man or the cosmic human being. They were dead. They had all been gone for hundreds or thousands of years in some cases. And Gandhi provided something that Einstein really valued a lot, which is, again, a living exemplar, like an actual person who's not just some saint or some sort of legend we have about someone who was a good person or a brilliant person, but someone who's walking around in the world, actually putting this stuff into practice, putting this idea of unity into practice. And I think Gandhi, again, I didn't know really this until I started researching the book and reading Gandhi's own words, which are quite beautiful. A lot of his sort of spirituality and his rationale for what he was doing, very much pulled from the same ideas. And he does a great quote I put in the book where there's a scholar, JTF Jordans, who was a Jesuit priest, I believe, who read, I think, all 90 volumes of Gandhi's writings to try to understand his spirituality and kind of the source of his religious ideas. And he's like, it's actually really simple. After I read the 90 volumes, it's non-dualism and non-violence. And it's that simple. If you see everything from this sort of monistic, non-dualistic worldview, then compassion, pacifism, non-violence becomes this kind of obvious ethical injunction to most people who embrace that worldview fully. And I think that's what Einstein loved about it, is he was really doing something that Einstein himself admitted he couldn't really do. Einstein kind of renounced his pacifism after the horrors of the Holocaust started to become apparent. He did, ask Roosevelt to build a nuclear bomb, which he anticipated using in self-defense, actually, but encouraged people to fight back against the Nazis. So he himself wasn't actually able to kind of go all the way and just sort of sacrifice himself the way Gandhi did. And I put that in there in the when Gandhi dies, it's actually because he refused armed protection, even though many people wanted to assassinate him, actually, for various grievances. And he said, no, I don't want weapons around me. And Einstein wrote this very moving eulogy for him when he died, saying, he died a victim of his own principle. He was so adamant about nonviolence that he refused even to let other people use violence to protect him. Mm. And that's how he ended up getting assassinated. So I think, all those things, similar source of the ethics, the ability to actually put the ethics into practice as a living exemplar of kind of what the cosmic religious feeling or what that sort of non-dualistic feeling can give someone. And there's some quotes I put from Gandhi, which I really loved, which was a total surprise to me to discover this, that Gandhi actually says it's not so much that you read a book about this and you're like, oh, everything's one, so I'm going to be a better person, or I'm going to sort of walk around and be nonviolent. He says pretty explicitly, he's like, you need to have that feeling. You need to have that spiritual experience, you could call it, or the mystical experience or whatever. You need to really feel it and then it becomes obvious afterwards. It's more like if you have the experience, if you kind of blend in with the non-duality, with the oneness of everything, even briefly, you come back from that changed, and the ethical side of it becomes obvious. It just kind of becomes natural to be nonviolent, to be a pacifist, to work with nonviolence. And he talks about actually you're being armed almost with this power of the cosmos, or this divine power of oneness. He said, in the same way that someone carrying a gun is going to rely on that power. If you're carrying weapons, you rely on the power of the weapons. And if you're carrying this other thing inside you, you rely on this unseen power of unity and bonding and kind of, just interconnectedness to sort of protect you and to give you energy to sort of do your work in the world. So,
one of the things I really dug about the book was, I come to Einstein before reading your book, and I go, this guy's got things figured out. Like, that's the way he's presented. A lot of times it's like, he's the guy, he's the smartest man ever. Like, we look at Einstein as a guy who figured things out. And I think that one of the cool parts about the book is the idea that he's really kind of wrestling through some stuff, and not always for certain on the way he feels about stuff. And then specifically, you kind of talk, there's some real contradictions in the way he looks at like free will. Can you talk a little bit about like the way he saw free will itself?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I love that chapter too. It's really hard to write because there's no clear message there, but I love that chapter because it really does show him at more human and his not kind of oracular. It's not just, what did Einstein say and what should we believe? But to see him really like an ordinary human being trying to struggle with these age old problems, kind of, are we really free? How much responsibility do we have? Can we attain more freedom, through sort of discipline or spiritual practice or however it is? And I think it was very contradictory. And I say this in the book that, we might hope that someone like Einstein, who's such an original thinker and such a genius, maybe he's resolved this dilemma. Maybe he's going to explain free will to us finally, or how free will lines up with physical laws. And I said, prepare to be disappointed, because it's actually just it's a bit of a mess when you read it, and there's no clear message emerges from it. But I'll say there does seem to be kind of a two-step thing where earlier in his life, he's very, very adamant that physics is kind of the final word, and he's very much a determinist. And this also comes from Spinoza, who felt the same way. So he's got kind of a philosophical and a physical approach to it, that everything's obeying these deterministic laws. In theory, everything's predictable from the first moment if you do it, if you had enough information, and that there's no freedom whatsoever, and that we're actually all just following this sort of cosmic lawfulness. I think later in life, most of the quotes I found that are more advocating for freedom came later in his life. And then I think as he thinks about it more and more, it seems like there's this appreciation that actually human beings in particular are so complex, and there's so much going on inside us that you kind of can attain some freedom. And it doesn't mean you can escape from your culture necessarily, or genetic heritage, or the physical laws, of course, that are around you. It's not really a supernatural sense, but it's this sense that there's the analogy I use in the book is actually like the earth and the sun. And so we say, the sun is about 1 million times heavier than the earth, and it causes the earth's orbit. It's a very simple and very accurate model to say that the earth goes around the sun, and you can just model that based on the sun's gravitational field, and you're done. But the reality, if you want to be really subtle and really specific about it, is that the earth also has a gravitational field, and it also has mass, and it creates a little dimple in that gravitational field. And actually it's the mutual interaction of the two creates the orbit of the earth. And you can't, it's 99.99% of it is from the sun, but part of it is from the little piece that's following it around. And, the more equal those things are, the less you can actually talk about causality of one thing being the cause and one thing being the effect. With the planet Jupiter, you start getting a bit more balance. If you have a double star system, you don't really ask which one's orbiting which one. I mean, they're orbiting each other, and it's a mutual interaction. And again, this is kind of like with the Big Bang, where physics itself is already saying this. When you get to three massive bodies interacting, it's already pretty much impossible to disentangle causality. And when you get out to the entire universe, you're like, well, the overall gravitational field, the overall electromagnetic field in the cosmos is determined by all the parts interacting at the same time. And you can, for convenience sake, you can kind of give the bigger or the stronger things the causal role, but it's not strictly speaking true. And I think that's exactly what we come back to with freedom and free will is that everything's integrated together, but the parts are also influencing the whole. And it's not just there's some top-down laws forcing all the parts to obey a certain way. It's that the whole fabric is influenced by each little part. And so it's a very it's a very spare definition of freedom, right? Where we're still extremely confined. We're very much limited by the place and time we find ourselves, and again, our genes, our biology, the physical laws. And yet, at the same time, there's this sort of precious little sliver of freedom we can have. And I think Einstein actually sort of tried to make the most of that, and really called people to live up to these high ethical standards and really sort of push people. We have to transform the world. We have to have nuclear disarmament. We have to have a world government, so we can't have these kind of horrific wars anymore. So I think he had a very, very narrow vision of what freedom is, and then these huge expectations of what we should do with that little bit of freedom that we do have.
Kieran, I want to ask you, every single author has parts of a book that don't make it into the book, things that end up getting cut for time, for page length, topic, whatever. Are there parts of this book that you had to leave out for any particular reason that you wish you could have put in?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's actually more was cut than is in the final text, actually, and a lot of that's just crap. It's not a loss to anybody, I promise. But badly written sentences and so on. But I didn't delete anything. I put it all in this file I call the compost. And
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I did a word count at one point at the end, and I was like, oh, the main text. There's a lot of notes, obviously, but the main text is about 72,000 words, something like that. And I couldn't believe that the compost text was more than that, actually. There's a few things I did leave out, which I really wanted, and I just couldn't integrate them. And my editor is brilliant and ruthless, and he was like, "This just isn't working." And
that's what you need.
Yeah, you can put this somewhere else, or you can write about it later. But this is not helping your book; it's just a distraction. So there's a few things that I really want. So one of them was Einstein on race and racism, and there's a brilliant book called that, actually, Einstein on race and racism. Forgot the name of the editors, and they kind of put together all his quotes on this. And he had, after he moved to the United States in the 30s and was living in Princeton, which actually has this long history of segregation that I didn't know about that went on, right up until Einstein's time. He felt this sort of affinity between Jews and African Americans, and he felt, really appalled to be living in America, where he thought of as this free society and that it was helping the Jews escape and so on. And then he realized there's this deep divide in American culture, and that, people are treated this way. And he definitely spoke out about that a lot. And he was in personal touch with some of the early leaders of the civil rights movement. So that's a beautiful sort of chapter on unity and sort of the unity of humanity and so on that I wanted to include, but it just didn't fit in so much with the story in terms of tying it in with his physics and his science. So it just didn't sort of make it in there. Another thing I wanted to include was about existentialism, because when you look at his ethics, it's very, very reminiscent of Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, and this idea that we kind of manifest as this physical being in this cosmos we don't understand, and there's no real God or ethical laws written in the cosmos telling us what to do, but we kind of just appear and we become conscious, and then suddenly we're kind of on our own, right? We're kind of floating around here wondering, what do we do? Or is there a heaven? Or how should we treat each other? And, what are the rules of this game? And there's, his point was that there is no rule maker. We make up our own rules, and we sort of define ourselves through our actions, not according to, the right beliefs or the right book or, whatever we happen to believe in. So there's a huge story, I think, there as well, but it's I just couldn't find enough direct quotes from Einstein to kind of justify it, or highlights in the books. So it became very speculative, and I was like, oh, I know he read Nietzsche, I know he met some of these existentialist philosophers, but I just couldn't quite put it together into the book. So those are two of the main sections that got cut. And there was actually a lot more about the Big Bang, which I wanted to include too, which just didn't quite fit in there. So the guy who actually came up with the Big Bang model was Georges Lemaitre, was a Belgian, French-Belgian physicist, cosmologist, mathematician, who was also considered, very brilliant and almost got the Nobel Prize a couple times. And Einstein was friends with him, and it was Einstein's physics that inspired him. And he kind of rewound general relativity, that model of the cosmos, and realized that it was not stable. You can't have this kind of perfectly stable universe unless the matter is balanced perfectly. It's like balancing the weight of the world on like a little thumbtack, right? It's unstable inherently. And he realized that it was more likely moving and dynamic and came from this original source. So that was a whole story, and they were, personal friends. And there's again, there's just not enough information to build a great story out of it. But they took walks around Caltech talking about the origin of the cosmos and the singularity and so on. So something I wanted to include in there, and I ended up cutting that whole chapter, which was very painful. But I'm like, I kept the very first part I put in the first chapter about kind of our origin in the Big Bang and how that sort of shows that we're unified. I saved some of the best parts, I think, for the first chapter. So.
Damn it, Kieran! I want my Einstein movie now. Is what happens. It's like after reading your book, after this conversation, now I want this man on screen. I this whole podcast started initially about movies and things like that, and I just want to see him. I want to see the man's life. I'm shocked that we still don't really have that big biopic.
Yeah, me too. I can't believe it because there's so many. There's so many scenes to choose from, and I think that maybe that's part of the problem is that it's going to be almost impossible to do it justice and make everyone happy. But I think I was watching Oppenheimer came out just as I was finishing the book, and has little scenes with Einstein, but also just addresses a lot of the same themes of sort of tapping into the power of the universe and giving us, we're like children with this godlike power now, and we're not responsible enough to use it wisely. And I thought this is so compelling. I mean, this is such nerdy stuff, and it's Christopher Nolan, so it's super highbrow and like chaotic storytelling, and yet it's this huge draw for people if it's done well. And I have spoken to a Hollywood screenwriter about this, but it's nothing's happening currently, so we'll see.
Well, I'm rooting for you, pal. Yeah. I want to ask you this, maybe the final question I have for you, Kieran, because I don't get a lot of medical practitioners on this podcast, and I'm so excited and happy that we were able to make this time today. You've done all this work. You've been to these places. You have searched inward and outward for these ideas. In your own mind, can science and spirituality coexist?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think Einstein put this well at one time. He said, the real stumbling block is the idea of a personal God, of a divinity that judges us and thinks the way we do. If you're willing to let that go, I think a lot of doors open up and a lot of different possibilities, and you can start to really explore it. And I think the way I end the book is the chapter with the eternal enigma, which is that he said a few different times in a few different ways that the really religious attitude is admitting our ignorance. The really religious worldview is to understand that we don't understand everything and to leave things open and to, you do your best with what you think you understand, but you don't close the book on anything. And you don't kind of say, this is our final knowledge of the world. This is our final ethical standard. All this stuff evolves over time and is open to kind of revision the way science is. So I think for me personally, again, it's a difficult worldview to explain to other people or to even to put into writing. But I feel like it certainly coexists in my own life. I think it definitely coexisted in Einstein's world. And I think that the key message I would try to bring back from that to sort of close with is to be paying attention to the world that's in front of us. I think that's kind of the core of it all, of pantheism or the cosmic religion, or how I feel personally, is that there's miracles all around us on some level. There's magic all around us. I mean, the cosmos is, from the scientific perspective alone, if you start studying physics and cosmology, it's absolutely mind blowing. But I feel the same thing. You go out for a hike and you look at what's happening in nature and just sort of the beauty and complexity everywhere in the flowers and trees and the animals, and in human beings. And it can be harder to see in humans, of course, because we have all these downsides as well, and all these bad behaviors. But I think it really is a matter of attention. And I actually say that I can't remember if it was in the beginning or the end of the book, where I said, a real understanding of pantheism requires a radical alteration of perception. And that's what it really is. It's not that you go somewhere else or that you start believing a certain thing. It's really a matter of seeing things differently. And that does sort of change everything. So,
brother, I have so many more questions for you at some other time, because I'm actually desperate to talk to you about your medical practice as well, because the stuff that you're doing, I think, is phenomenal. Dude, this has been awesome. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for like taking the time. I know it's early out there to get going and so forth. I know you got a crazy day ahead of you today, but man, thank
Yeah.
you so much for being here, man. This has been a blast.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much, man. A very, very fun conversation. So yeah, let's talk again.
Let's do it.